The Complete Story of Mary Shelley. Part 1. A Birth Surrounded by Ideas, Loss and Revolution, 1797. Mary Shelley was born on August 30th, 1797, in London, into a world already charged with ideas, controversy, and intellectual fire. Even before she could speak, her life was shaped by two extraordinary minds and by a devastating loss. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the most radical thinkers of the late 18th century and the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Wollstonecraft believed fiercely that women were not naturally inferior to men, but merely denied education and opportunity. At a time when such views were considered scandalous, she wrote with clarity, anger, and moral courage. Her father was William Godwin, a philosopher, novelist, and political theorist. Godwin believed in reason, social justice, and the possibility of a better society without tyranny. He moved in circles filled with writers, scientists, radicals, and thinkers who debated the future of humanity late into the night. Mary Shelley was born directly into this intellectual storm, but tragedy arrived almost immediately. Just 11 days after giving birth, Mary Wollstonecraft died from complications following childbirth, an infection that, at the time, medicine could not treat. The woman who had fought so fiercely for women's rights never lived to raise her own daughter. Mary Shelley grew up knowing that her existence had cost her mother's life. This fact would haunt her quietly for years. William Godwin was devastated, but he did not retreat from the world. He raised Mary surrounded by books, ideas, and conversation. Their house was visited by poets, scientists, philosophers, and political exiles. Mary listened from the corners of rooms as adults spoke about revolutions, human nature, science, morality, and progress. Yet despite the brilliance around her, Mary's childhood was not warm. Godwin remarried a woman who did not love Mary and treated her with emotional coldness. Mary often felt isolated, unwanted, and overshadowed by the ghost of the mother she never knew, a woman everyone admired but whom Mary could never meet. She found comfort in reading, writing, and imagining. As a child, she would visit her mother's grave and read there alone. It became a place of reflection, grief, and connection, a quiet ritual that fused love, death, memory, and creativity. From the very beginning, Mary Shelley's life was marked by great ideas, early loss, intellectual intensity, emotional solitude, all the raw material that would later give birth to one of the most enduring stories ever written. Part 2. A lonely childhood among books, ghosts, and expectations. After her mother's death, Mary grew up in a house that was intellectually alive but emotionally uneven. William Godwin believed deeply in education and reason, yet he was distant as a father. He expected strength, self-discipline, and independence, even from a young girl who was quietly grieving a mother she had never known. Mary was largely self-educated. She read constantly: history, philosophy, poetry, science, travel narratives, and Gothic fiction. Her father's library became her refuge. While other children played, Mary lived inside books, absorbing ideas far beyond her years. But she was also deeply lonely. Godwin's second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, favored her own children and treated Mary with coldness and criticism. Mary felt like an outsider in her own home, tolerated, not cherished. This emotional neglect left a mark. She grew introspective, sensitive, and prone to intense inner worlds. She began writing very young, short stories, imaginary lives, fragments of thought. Writing was not a hobby. It was a survival instinct. One of the most striking aspects of Mary's childhood was her relationship with death. She knew from the start that her mother had died giving birth to her. This knowledge was not hidden from her. Godwin wrote openly about Wollstonecraft's life and death, believing honesty was virtuous. But for Mary, the truth carried a quiet burden of guilt and responsibility. She often visited her mother's grave at St. Pancras churchyard. There alone she read, wrote, and thought. The grave became a strange sanctuary, a place where imagination, mourning, and identity intertwined. This early intimacy with death would later echo powerfully in her work. Despite the sadness, Mary was intellectually gifted. Godwin recognized this and encouraged her learning. Visitors to the house, poets, scientists, radicals, often notice a quiet girl listening carefully from the edges of conversation, absorbing everything. She learned early how ideas shape lives, and how ideals can collide painfully with reality. This tension between brilliance and neglect, reason and emotion, creation and loss, became the emotional engine of her inner life. And then, when she was still a teenager, someone entered her world who would change everything, not gently, not safely, but irrevocably. Part 3. Percy Shelley, Love, Rebellion, and Flight, 1814. In 1814, when Mary was just 16 years old, her life changed suddenly and completely. A young poet began visiting her father's house. His name was Percy Shelley. Percy was already infamous. He was brilliant, idealistic, and openly rebellious. He believed in political freedom, atheism, free love, and the radical reshaping of society. He wrote poetry filled with fire and beauty, and he lived as intensely as he wrote. He was also married. Despite this, Percy and Mary were drawn to each other with extraordinary force. They shared a deep intellectual connection. They spoke for hours about philosophy, poetry, justice, science, and the future of humanity. For Mary, Percy represented something she had never known, someone who truly saw her mind and treated her as an equal. Their relationship grew quickly and dangerously. Mary fell in love not just with Percy, but with the idea of a life lived boldly, without compromise. Percy, in turn, saw in Mary a rare intellect and emotional depth, but their love was scandalous. When Mary and Percy confessed their feelings, Godwin, who had preached radical freedom all his life, reacted with anger and betrayal. He cut Mary off emotionally and financially. The irony was painful. The philosopher who believed in freedom could not accept his daughter's choice. In July 1814, Mary made a decision that would define her life. She ran away with Percy Shelley. They left England together, accompanied by Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont. They traveled through France, Switzerland, and Germany, often on foot, often hungry, often exhausted. Europe was still scarred by war, and money was scarce. The journey was not romantic in the way novels suggest. They faced illness, poverty, rejection, and constant social condemnation. Mary was only 16, pregnant, and completely cut off from her family. Yet she did not turn back. During this journey, Mary kept a journal. In it, she recorded landscapes, emotions, arguments, fears, and hopes. This habit of close observation of the outer world and the inner one would later shape her writing profoundly. Eventually, reality caught up with them. They returned to England, still unmarried, still poor, still ostracized. Mary gave birth to a baby girl prematurely. The child died only days after birth. Mary was devastated. She dreamed that the baby came back to life, that she warmed it by the fire and it began to breathe again. The dream stayed with her, painfully vivid. It was her first direct encounter with the unbearable finality of death, and with the desperate human wish to reverse it. This loss marked the beginning of a long pattern. Mary Shelley would experience repeated grief throughout her life, especially connected to childbirth and motherhood. Love had brought her freedom. It had also brought her sorrow, and she was still only at the beginning. Part 4, Death, Exile, and Becoming a Writer, 1815 to 1816. After the death of her first child, Mary sank into a quiet grief that never fully left her. She was still very young, still socially rejected, and still living in precarious circumstances. Yet life did not pause to let her recover. In 1815, Mary gave birth to a son, William. This time the child survived, and Mary clung to him with fierce love. Motherhood brought her comfort, but also constant anxiety. She had already learned how fragile life could be. Percy Shelley, meanwhile, continued to live according to his ideals, often without regard for practical consequences. His financial recklessness and emotional complexity created instability. Mary loved him deeply, but their relationship was far from simple. There were moments of intense closeness and moments of distance, jealousy, and strain. They lived under the shadow of Harriet Shelley, Percy's wife, whom he had left behind. Society condemned Mary as immoral, regardless of her youth or circumstances. Then, in December 1816, tragedy struck again. Harriet Shelley drowned herself. Soon after Harriet's death, Percy and Mary married, partly to gain custody of Percy's children and partly to regain a measure of social legitimacy. But the damage to Mary's reputation could not be undone. By this time, grief had become a familiar companion. That same year, Mary and Percy left England again and traveled to Switzerland, near Lake Geneva. There, they stayed near the poet Lord Byron, along with Claire Clairmont and others. This summer would change literary history. The weather that year was strange and oppressive, the result of volcanic eruption that had darkened skies across Europe. Rain fell constantly. Confined indoors, the group spent their evenings reading ghost stories aloud and discussing science, philosophy, and the nature of life itself. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person would write a ghost story. At first, Mary struggled. She felt blocked, anxious, and inadequate compared to the famous men around her. But then one night, she experienced what she later called a waking dream, a vision that struck her with terrifying clarity. She imagined a young scientist kneeling beside a lifeless form. She imagined the moment when that form began to stir. She imagined the horror of creation without responsibility. From that vision, Frankenstein was born. Mary was only 18 years old. She did not write a simple horror story. She wrote a profound meditation on ambition, creation, isolation, and the consequences of scientific power, themes deeply rooted in her own life of loss, longing, and moral questioning. At this point, Mary Shelley was no longer just the daughter of great thinkers or the lover of a famous poet. She was becoming a writer in her own right. Part 5. Writing Frankenstein. Creation, Fear, and Silence, 1816 to 1818. After the night of the Ghost Story Challenge by Lake Geneva, Mary could not let her vision go. It haunted her, not as a fleeting image, but as a moral question that demanded be written. She began to expand the idea slowly. What if a human being could create life? What responsibility would follow such an act? What happens when a creator abandons what they have made? Mary did not write impulsively. She wrote thoughtfully, shaping the story through reflection, conversation, and revision. Percy Shelley encouraged her, discussed ideas with her, and later helped edit the manuscript. But the core vision, structure, and emotional force were Mary's. The novel grew into something far more complex than a ghost story. It became a layered narrative, framed by letters and voices, full of philosophical tension. The creature was not a mindless monster, but a sensitive, intelligent being who learned language, literature, and morality, and who was destroyed by rejection and loneliness. These were not abstract themes for Mary. She knew what it meant to feel abandoned. She knew what it meant to love deeply and be cast out. She knew the pain of creation followed by loss. In 1818, the novel was published anonymously as Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Most readers assumed the author was Percy Shelley. Some praised the book's imagination and power. Others were horrified by its implications, especially the idea that science, unchecked by morality, could lead to ruin. Very few suspected that the author was a young woman of 20, shaped by grief, exile, and intellectual intensity. Mary watched the reception quietly. She did not rush to claim recognition. At that time, being a woman and a controversial one, made public authorship dangerous. Instead, she observed how the world reacted to her creation, much like Victor Frankenstein watching his own. The irony was sharp. A novel about a creator losing control of their creation was now circulating, without her name attached to it. Yet Frankenstein began to live its own life. It spread across Europe, provoking debate about science, ethics, ambition, and responsibility. It touched nerves that had never been exposed so clearly before. Mary Shelley had given the world a new myth, but her personal life was far from settled. Loss was not finished with her. Part 6. Motherhood, Mourning, and the Way to Survival, 1818 to 1822. After the publication of Frankenstein, Mary and Percy Shelley left England once again, settling in Italy. They hoped the climate would improve Percy's health, and that distance would bring peace. Instead, Italy became the stage for the most devastating period of Mary's life. Between 1818 and 1822, Mary experienced repeated loss on a scale that few could endure. Her children began to die. Her daughter Clara fell ill and died in 1818, before reaching her first birthday. Not long after, her son William, the child she loved most intensely, also died of illness in 1819. Mary was shattered. She wrote that she felt as if her heart had been torn out. Motherhood, would have been her deepest source of meaning, became inseparable from grief. She blamed herself. She questioned fate. She struggled with depression, so severe that at times she felt emotionally numb. Percy, overwhelmed by his own ideals and inner turbulence, did not always know how to support her. He urged her toward reason, philosophy, and hope, but Mary was drowning in sorrow that could not be argued away. Only one child survived, Percy Florence Shelley, born in 1819. Mary clung to him with protective intensity, terrified that death would take him too. Despite everything, she continued to write. She revised Frankenstein for later editions and began new works, including novels, travel writing, and short fiction. Writing was not just ambition. It was a way to remain alive. Then in 1822, tragedy struck with brutal finality. Percy Shelley drowned in a boating accident off the coast of Viareggio, Italy. He was only 29 years old. Mary was 24. She was now a widow, far from home, surrounded by memories of love and loss. Percy's body was cremated on the beach, according to quarantine laws. His ashes were buried in Rome, but his heart, calcified by disease, survived the flames. Mary kept it wrapped in silk for the rest of her life. In a few short years, Mary had lost her mother, 3 children, her husband. She had survived them all, and survival, for Mary Shelley, was both a burden and a responsibility. Part 7. A Widow at 24, Memory, Duty, and Endurance, 1822 to 1824. After Percy Shelley's death, Mary's world collapsed into silence. She was 24 years old, alone in a foreign country, responsible for a small child, and surrounded by ghosts. Italy, once a place of inspiration and movement, became unbearable. Everywhere she looked, she saw Percy, in the sea and the light, in unfinished sentences. Eventually, she returned to England with her son, Percy Florence. Home was not a refuge. Society still viewed her with suspicion. As a young widow with a radical past, she did not fit neatly into respectable life. Worse still, Percy's father, Sir Timothy Shelley, controlled the family money. He agreed to support Mary and the child only if she remained silent about Percy's life and avoided public scandal. Mary accepted. She had no choice. This agreement shaped her next years profoundly. She was financially dependent, emotionally isolated, and bound by restrictions that limited her freedom of expression. Yet she endured with quiet determination. Her primary purpose became clear: to preserve Percy Shelley's legacy and protect their son's future. Mary devoted herself to editing and publishing Percy's poems. She wrote introductions, annotations, and explanatory notes that framed his work with dignity and moral seriousness. Without her efforts, much of Percy Shelley's poetry might have faded into obscurity. At the same time, she continued to write her own fiction, but her tone changed. The fire of youthful rebellion softened into reflection, restraint, and melancholy. Her later novels explored themes of memory, loss, exile, and endurance rather than revolutionary transformation. Mary was no longer chasing ideas. She was carrying them. She lived quietly, moving between lodgings, avoiding controversy, raising her son with fierce devotion. Percy Florence became the emotional center of her life, her anchor against the past and her hope for the future. Yet grief never truly left her. She kept Percy's heart wrapped in silk in her desk. She reread old letters. She wrote in journals filled with remembrance and restraint. Her life became an act of careful balance between remembering too much and surviving it all. Mary Shelley was learning how to live after catastrophe. Part 8. Riding in the Shadow of Loss. A different kind of ambition, 1824 to 1830. As the years passed, Mary Shelley settled into a quieter, more disciplined life. The intensity of her youth had been replaced by something harder and slower, endurance. She continued to write, but no longer with the reckless fire of her early years. Her ambition had changed. She was no longer trying to shock the world or reshape it. She was trying to understand it and to survive within it. During this period, Mary published several novels, including Valperga, The Last Man, Perkin Warbeck, and Lodore. These works were thoughtful, serious, and often somber. They explored political ideals, historical responsibility, and, above all, what it means to live after loss. One novel stood apart. The Last Man imagined a future in which a plague slowly wipes out humanity, leaving one final survivor to walk alone through an empty world. At the time, readers found it bleak and unsettling. Many rejected it, but the novel was deeply personal. Mary had already lived in a world where almost everyone she loved was gone. The loneliness she described was not speculative. It was lived experience. In hindsight, the book reads as one of the earliest and most profound works of existential science fiction. Despite her intelligence and productivity, Mary struggled financially. Writing was not reliably profitable, especially for a woman. She often wrote under pressure, negotiating with publishers, revising endlessly, and suppressing parts of herself to remain acceptable. Her relationship with her father, William Godwin, remained strained. He depended on her financially, but rarely offered emotional support. Mary learned, again and again, that love did not always flow where it should. Her son, Percy Florence, grew into a sensitive, thoughtful boy. Mary educated him carefully, determined to give him stability she had never known. She worried constantly about his health, his future, and his place in a society that still distrusted his parents' legacy. Through all of this, Mary Shelley remained composed on the surface, but inside, she carried a lifetime of grief, memory, and discipline, transformed into prose that was quieter than Frankenstein, but no less serious. She was no longer a prodigy. She was a working writer, a single mother, and a guardian of memory. Part 9, Recognition, Revision, and Owning Frankenstein, 1830 to 1831. By the early 1830s, the literary world was beginning to shift. Romanticism was fading, and a more reflective, moral tone was taking its place. In this changing landscape, Mary Shelley slowly reemerged, not as a scandalous figure, but as a serious author shaped by experience. Most importantly, Frankenstein returned to the public eye. The novel had continued to circulate, adapt, and provoke fascination. Stage versions had transformed the creature into a mute monster, stripping away much of Mary's philosophical depth. While these adaptations brought popularity, they also distorted her original vision. Mary decided it was time to speak. In 1831, she published a new edition of Frankenstein, this time under her own name. She also added a long author's introduction, explaining how the story had come into being during the famous summer at Lake Geneva. This introduction became one of the most influential literary reflections on creativity ever written. Mary described the birth of the novel not as cold calculation, but as something closer to a dream, an image that forced itself upon her imagination. Yet she was careful to frame the story in morally acceptable terms, emphasizing caution, humility, and responsibility. Some critics later noted that the 1831 edition softened certain radical elements of the original 1818 text. This was not accidental. Mary was older now. She was more cautious. She was living within constraints. Claiming Frankenstein publicly meant accepting both recognition and judgment. But it also meant reclaiming authorship over a work that had been misread, misattributed, and reshaped by others. For the first time, the world widely acknowledged that one of its most powerful modern myths had been created by a woman. Mary Shelley did not celebrate loudly. She never sought fame in the usual sense. What mattered to her was control over her work, her narrative, and her legacy. And yet, even as she reclaimed her most famous creation, her own life remained quiet, disciplined, and shaped by responsibility rather than ambition. She was still living for the future of her son. She was still living with the past. Part 10, A Life of Quiet Authority. Mother, editor, thinker, 1831 to 1839. After openly reclaiming Frankenstein, Mary Shelley entered the most stable period of her adult life, though stability, for her, never meant ease. She was now in her 30s, respected but not celebrated, known but not fully understood. The world saw her as the widow of Percy Shelley and the author of a single great novel. Mary knew herself to be much more than that. Her daily life revolved around work and motherhood. She continued editing Percy Shelley's poetry, producing careful editions that shaped how future generations would read him. She was meticulous, protective, and intellectually rigorous. In many ways, she became the architect of his posthumous reputation. At the same time, she wrote steadily, novels, biographies, essays, reviews, and travel writing. She contributed to literary annuals and magazines, often anonymously or under financial necessity. Her prose during this period was clear, controlled, and morally reflective. Mary was no longer interested in provocation. She believed literature should illuminate, not merely shock. Her son, Percy Florence, grew into a thoughtful young man with artistic inclinations and fragile health. Mary devoted herself to him completely, sometimes to the point of self-erasure. She limited her social life, avoided emotional risk, and organized her entire existence around his well-being. This devotion came at a cost. Mary remained emotionally isolated. She never remarried. She formed friendships but kept careful boundaries. Love for her had become inseparable from loss. Yet she was not bitter. She maintained intellectual curiosity and followed scientific developments, political debates, and literary movements. She believed deeply in progress, but a progress tempered by humility and ethical restraint. By this stage, Mary Shelley had become a figure of quiet authority. She did not dominate conversations or movements. She influenced through clarity, memory, and persistence. Her life was no longer dramatic. It was deliberate. Part 11. The Burden of Being Remembered, 1839 to 1844. As Mary Shelley moved into her 40s, she became increasingly aware of how history was beginning to fix her, not as a living thinker, but as a figure of the past. Percy Shelley's reputation was growing rapidly. Younger poets admired him. Critics reassessed his work. His image solidified into that of a tragic, idealistic genius. Mary watched this process carefully. She was proud, but also uneasy. She knew Percy better than anyone. His brilliance, his generosity, his contradictions, his recklessness. She feared that myth would replace truth. Through her editorial work, she tried to preserve balance, neither sanctifying him nor diminishing him. At the same time, Mary felt herself fading from public view. Her later novels received polite attention, but little passion. Readers wanted Frankenstein and little else. This quiet marginalization hurt, even if she rarely admitted it. Physically, her health began to decline. She suffered from headaches, periods of weakness, and symptoms that may have been early signs of the illness that would later take her life. Still, she continued to work steadily, refusing to surrender to frailty. In 1840, she helped organize a major collection of Percy Shelley's poems, cementing his place in the literary canon. Without her, his work might have remained scattered and misunderstood. Mary knew this, yet she accepted that history often remembers creators unevenly. She once wrote that she felt like a ghost walking among memories, alive, productive, but partially unseen. Still, she did not withdraw. She traveled when she could, including a journey through Germany and Italy in the early 1840s. Travel allowed her to revisit places tied to both love and loss, and to write with renewed clarity about memory and landscape. Mary Shelley had become something rare, a woman who outlived her legend, and learned to live beside it. Part 12, Illness, Reflection, and the Slow Narrowing of Life, 1844 to 1848. By the mid-1840s, Mary Shelley's world had begun to contract. Her health declined more noticeably now. She suffered frequent, intense headaches, bouts of dizziness, weakness in her limbs, and periods of exhaustion that forced her to stop working for days or weeks at a time. Modern scholars believe she may have been suffering from a brain tumor, though medicine at the time could offer no clear diagnosis. Mary endured the pain quietly. She had spent her life learning how to function despite suffering, and she applied the same discipline now. She continued to write when she could, to read, to edit, to think, but the pace of her life slowed. Her son, Percy Florence, was now a young man. His future became Mary's final long-term concern. She wanted him to have stability, respectability, and freedom from the shadow of scandal that had followed his parents. Ironically, the same Shelley family that had once constrained her now opened its doors to him. Sir Timothy Shelley accepted Percy Florence as heir, ensuring his financial security, something Mary herself had never fully known. This gave her relief. For the first time, she could imagine a future that did not depend entirely on her own survival. Emotionally, Mary became increasingly reflective. She reread old journals and letters, revisiting the voices of the dead. Her mother, Percy, lost children, vanished friends. Memory became less painful and more contemplative, a quiet companionship rather than an open wound. She wrote less fiction now, but her prose remained precise and thoughtful. Even in illness, her mind stayed sharp. She followed political changes across Europe and remained interested in science, especially developments that echoed the ethical questions she had raised decades earlier in Frankenstein. Creation, responsibility, limits, these themes never left her. Her life was growing smaller. Her inner world was not. Part 13. Preparing for Silence, Legacy, Control, and Letting Go, 1848 to 1850. In the final years of her life, Mary Shelley became increasingly aware that time was no longer something she could assume. Illness forced her to confront what she had avoided for decades, the question of what will remain when she was gone. Mary had never been careless with legacy. Now, she became deliberate. She organized her papers, letters, journals, and manuscripts with great care. She decided what should survive and what should remain private. Some letters were preserved lovingly. Others were withheld, edited, or quietly destroyed. Mary understood how easily lives could be simplified, distorted, or misunderstood. She wanted no sensational afterlife, only accuracy. Her relationship with her son deepened during this period. Percy Florence was gentle, dutiful, and devoted to her. Mary, in turn, loosened her grip, slowly allowing him independence, friendships, and a future not entirely shaped by her grief. This letting go was not easy. Motherhood had been her final great attachment to life, but she did not cling selfishly. She believed love required freedom, a belief inherited from both her parents and painfully tested by experience. Despite physical decline, her mind remained lucid. She continued reading widely and followed debates about science, politics, and society. She saw the modern world accelerating, industry expanding, science advancing, old moral certainties eroding. She recognized it. She had imagined its dangers long ago. Frankenstein, once dismissed by many as a Gothic curiosity, was beginning to be understood as something more prophetic. Mary did not live to see its full cultural impact, but she sensed that the questions it asked would not fade. What are the limits of human power? Who is responsible for creation? What happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? These were no longer just literary questions. They were becoming real. Mary Shelley had spent her life living between eras, Born into revolutionary idealism, matured through catastrophic loss, and died at the threshold of modernity. She had learned that ideas survive people, but people pay the price for ideas. Part 14, Death in London, and a Life Closed Quietly, 1851. In early 1851, Mary Shelley's illness worsened rapidly. The headaches became more violent. Her strength faded. At times, she struggled to speak or write for long periods. Those close to her understood that the end was approaching, though medicine could still offer no name or cure for what was happening inside her body. Mary faced this final stage of life without drama. There were no grand declarations, no attempts to shape public memory in her final moments. She remained private, controlled, and composed, as she had been for most of her adult life. She died on February 1st, 1851, in London at the age of 53. The cause of death was officially recorded as a disease of the brain. She was buried at St. Peter's Church, Bournemouth, later moved there to rest beside her parents. In death, she was reunited with the people who had defined her beginnings, the radical philosopher father and the revolutionary feminist mother she had never known. Among her personal effects, her son discovered something extraordinary. Wrapped carefully in silk inside her writing desk was Percy Shelley's heart, preserved for nearly 30 years. It was the most intimate symbol of a love that had shaped her youth and haunted her adulthood. Mary Shelley's death passed quietly. There were no crowds, no monuments, no immediate reassessment of her importance. At the time, she was remembered mainly as the widow of Percy Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Almost no one yet understood the full weight of what she had contributed. But silence in Mary Shelley's life was never emptiness. It was simply a pause before understanding. Part 15, After Death, Misunderstood, Simplified, Persistent, 1851, 1880s. After Mary Shelley's death, her reputation entered a long period of distortion and reduction. Victorian society did not know what to do with her. She did not fit the image of the proper woman writer. She had lived unconventionally, loved radically, and written a novel that challenged religion, science, and male authority. So history did what it often does in such cases. It simplified her. Mary Shelley was remembered mainly as the wife of Percy Shelley, the accidental author of Frankenstein. Her other novels were largely ignored. Her intellectual independence was downplayed. Her role as an editor, thinker, and moral voice was minimized. Even worse, Frankenstein itself was increasingly misrepresented. Stage adaptations and popular retellings turned the story into a crude tale of a mad scientist and a mute monster. The philosophical depth, the questions of responsibility, abandonment, and ethical creation were stripped away for spectacle. Mary's creature lost his voice, and with it, Mary's voice was also muted. Yet the novel refused to disappear. It continued to be read, adapted, argued over, and reshaped. Each generation found something unsettling in it. Science advanced. Industry grew. Experiments once unthinkable became real. And Frankenstein began to feel uncomfortably relevant. Quietly, scholars and readers started to notice something. This book was not naive. It was not accidental. It was not simple horror. It was modern. Mary Shelley, long dismissed as a secondary figure, had written one of the first works to truly grapple with the moral consequences of scientific power. She had anticipated a world that was only just beginning. Understanding was slow, but it was coming. Part 16, Reclamation. Seeing Mary Shelley clearly, late 19th, early 20th century. By the late 19th century, the world had changed in ways Mary Shelley would have recognized immediately. Science was no longer speculative. It was industrial, institutional, and powerful. Electricity, medicine, engineering, and chemistry were reshaping daily life. The optimism of progress existed side by side with fear. Fear of dehumanization, of moral blindness, of creation's escaping control. And suddenly, Frankenstein no longer felt like an old Gothic curiosity. It felt prophetic. Scholars began to return to the original text, especially the 1818 version, and discovered a very different novel from the popular caricature. The creature spoke eloquently. He read philosophy and poetry. He reasoned, suffered, and demanded accountability. This forced a reevaluation. Who had written this? And how? As critics looked more closely at Mary Shelley's life, something became undeniable. This was not the work of a passive girl or a borrowed imagination. It was the work of a mind shaped by radical political thought, scientific debate, personal grief, ethical seriousness. Mary Shelley began to be seen not merely as Percy Shelley's widow, but as his equal, and in some ways more forward-looking than he was. Early feminist thinkers also took notice. Here was a woman who had grown up among male intellectuals, written a foundational modern myth, explored power, responsibility, and creation, survived erasure, and she had done so without self-promotion, without protection, and without a movement behind her. Reclamation was slow, but it was real. Mary Shelley was no longer just remembered. She was being understood. Part 17, The Mother of Science Fiction and Modern Anxiety, 20th Century. During the 20th century, Mary Shelley's position in literary history changed decisively. As science fiction emerged as a recognized genre, critics began searching for its origins. They found them not in machines or spaceships, but in a single, unsettling question. What happens when human knowledge outpaces human responsibility? At the center of that question stood Frankenstein. Mary Shelley came to be recognized as a founder of science fiction, not because she imagined technology, but because she imagined its ethical consequences. Her novel was not about electricity or anatomy. It was about choice, abandonment, and accountability. This distinction mattered. Modern science fiction often returned to her core themes. Creators who refuse responsibility. Beings brought into existence without consent. Intelligence treated as property. Isolation produced by rejection. As the 20th century faced world wars, nuclear weapons, genetic experimentation, and artificial intelligence, Mary Shelley's questions felt disturbingly current. She had anticipated not inventions, but dilemmas. At the same time, feminist literary criticism fully reclaimed her. Scholars dismantled the myth that Percy Shelley had been the true author of Frankenstein. Manuscripts proved Mary's authorship beyond doubt. Her intellectual independence was restored. Her later novels were reread with new seriousness. Mary Shelley was no longer an exception. She became an example of how women's work had been overlooked, simplified, or attributed elsewhere. Universities began teaching her not as a curiosity, but as a central figure in modern thought, alongside philosophers, scientists, and political theorists. Her life story, once reduced to scandal, was now read as a case study in resilience, ethical seriousness, and intellectual courage. Mary Shelley had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just part history. She was shaping how history understood itself. Part 18, Popular Culture, Distortion, and Immortality mid-late 20th century. As Mary Shelley's intellectual importance became clearer in academic circles, her most famous creation took on a second, more chaotic life in popular culture. Cinema, theater, comics, and television embraced Frankenstein enthusiastically, but not faithfully. Hollywood transformed the creature into a symbol: green skin, bolts in the neck, inarticulate violence. This image bore little resemblance to Mary Shelley's original being, articulate, sensitive, and morally aware. The scientist, too, became a caricature of madness rather than a study in moral failure. Mary Shelley's name often vanished behind the spectacle, yet something remarkable happened. Even in distortion, the story survived. Each adaptation, however inaccurate, carried the core anxiety forward. Fear of uncontrolled creation. Audiences responded instinctively, even when philosophy was stripped away. Meanwhile, writers, filmmakers, and thinkers continued to return to the original novel, often explicitly. Frankenstein became a reference point for discussions about cloning, artificial intelligence, robotics, and bioethics. Mary Shelley's shadow stretched across modern culture. She influenced not just literature, but how society imagines responsibility in science, the ethics of innovation, the loneliness of the created, the danger of ambition without empathy. By this stage, Mary Shelley was no longer merely an author. She was a framework, a way of thinking about modernity itself. Her life, once private, restrained, and marked by grief, had produced a story that refused to die. Immortality, ironically, came not through fame, but through relevance. Part 19, Mary Shelley and the World We Live in Now. In the 21st century, Mary Shelley feels less like a historical figure and more like a contemporary voice. Her central question, what responsibility does a creator have toward what they create, sits at the heart of modern life. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate technology, surveillance systems, algorithmic power. Again and again, society asks questions that Mary Shelley asked first, not in technical terms, but in human ones. Who is responsible when a system causes harm? What obligations exist after creation? What happens when creators walk away? Frankenstein offers no simple answers. That is part of its power. Mary Shelley did not write a warning against science itself, but against carelessness, hubris, and moral avoidance. Her creature is not evil by nature. He is made monstrous by neglect. This insight feels particularly modern. Mary Shelley's life also speaks powerfully to the present. She navigated grief, isolation, social judgment, and erasure without losing intellectual seriousness. She lived in a world that did not reward women's ambition, and she wrote anyway. Today, she is studied not just in literature departments, but in ethics, philosophy of science, gender studies, technology studies. Her work crosses boundaries because her thinking did. Mary Shelley did not imagine the future. She imagined us. Part 20, Mary Shelley, A Life of Thought, Loss, and Moral Courage. Mary Shelley's life was not triumphant in the conventional sense. She did not live long. She did not live easily. She did not live loudly. Yet few writers have left a deeper mark. Born into revolutionary ideas and early loss, she learned from the beginning that creation and destruction often arrive together. She grew up among thinkers but lacked warmth, and so she turned inward, developing a mind capable of both imagination and restraint. She loved intensely, paid dearly for it, and survived when almost everyone she loved did not. Out of that survival came a story that refused comfort. Frankenstein is not a tale of monsters. It is a story about abandonment, about responsibility refused, about the suffering created when power outruns empathy. Mary Shelley lived these truths before she wrote them. She never sought to dominate the world intellectually. She worked patiently, often invisibly, shaping ideas that would outlive her by centuries. She accepted obscurity without surrendering seriousness. Her courage was not theatrical. It was moral. Today, Mary Shelley stands not only as the author of a great novel, but as one of the first writers to understand what modernity would demand of us. Not just knowledge, but accountability. She asked a question once. The world has been answering it ever since. Epilogue. What remains after the story ends? The story has reached its natural end, but Mary Shelley herself would have understood that endings are rarely clean. What remains is not just a book, a name, or a reputation, but a way of thinking. Mary Shelley never claimed certainty. She distrusted easy answers. Her work insists on something harder, moral attention, to look at what we make, to stay with it, to take responsibility even when the consequences are uncomfortable, even when love is not returned, even when society turns away. That insistence is why she still matters. She did not imagine monsters to frighten us. She imagined neglect and showed us its cost. In that sense, her life and her work are inseparable. She created carefully, suffered deeply, and refused to simplify either experience. She accepted that to create is to risk grief, and that avoiding responsibility is the true failure. Mary Shelley does not ask to be admired. She asks to be listened to. And as long as the world keeps creating without fully understanding what it owes its creations, her voice will never be finished.